Welcome to Reddit Aliens. Serious. Therapists of Reddit. When was a time you realized that one of your clients was just a bad person? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Client told me about cornering their daughter, whose claims of sexual abuse the client didn't believe, with various sex toys. Said daughter couldn't show client how to use them, so she must have been lying. Client stopped coming after I called child services. I won't give hard numbers, but the client had more kids than you can count on one hand, all of whom were taken by child services at different points. I was the third person this client had seen, and none of us could get the client to acknowledge any degree of responsibility. Childhood abuse is horrible, wrong, and can mess a person up for a long time, but that does not make it okay to do the same to your kids. May I ask, this may be incredibly general, I'm sure it is, but is there a common practice when seeing new clients to let them do 95% of the talking? I visited a small handful of therapists over time, all for, I guess, just help sorting out minor stimulus of life, and every single one would mostly only listen and let me lead the conversation. I meant typing this out, it sounds dumb because it was me in therapy. I should be the one talking, but I don't know. I never really experienced a back and forth with any therapy before. I hope I was clear with my example. I had one client that just didn't care about cheating on his wife. He got married really young, not sure why, they didn't have kids, but by the time I met him, he was in his 30s. He only came in because his wife threatened to leave him if he didn't. He also thought he might be a narcissist. He calmly discussed how he cheated on his wife constantly during their 20s together, and showed little if any remorse about this. He seemed to be proud of his ability to sleep with women. It seemed his remorse was that she wanted to leave him, and he got some benefit from her being around, but he didn't really care about hurting her. Still, he came in for his first few sessions saying the right things and claiming to want to be a better husband. Then he came in after a family party. He told a story about how he was just talking to a 19-year-old woman there. Of course, as the story went on, it became clear he was obviously flirting and getting progressively drunker and bolder throughout the party. This was also in front of his wife's whole family. He began hitting on this girl badly, touching her, and came close to kissing her before his wife literally had to drag him away while crying. Again, he showed very little if any remorse. He didn't do anything, and didn't see why this was a big deal. I tried to help him make connections, but it wasn't getting through. Right before the end of this session, I informed him the office would begin enforcing a mask mandate start of COVID. He didn't show to his next appointment, and when I called him to tell him I would apply the missed session fee, he claimed he never actually confirmed this appointment and had never fully committed to coming back the next week, even though we agreed to it. I knew he would be a problem, so I just waived it and took him off the schedule. Never heard from him again, and I was glad that was the case. I don't think he was a monster, but man, he was such an asshole. I agree with most of the therapists here saying that bad is a very broad spectrum and it's a mix of good and bad, but some people are just assholes. A client told me that whenever he sees his 4-year-old son struggling to get something done or trying to learn something, he makes fun of him and tells him he's stupid and will never succeed. He later told me his mother used to be an absolute unpredictable tyrant around the house, and as a child, he was put in a barn in the garden with no food for days. Even though I felt for him, I couldn't help but feel anger towards him. I'm relatively new at it, second year practicing after 6 years of studying, and there's one client that just bugs me. I know she is a product of abuse and mental illness, but she has inflicted so much harm on everyone around her, including her own kids, which she does not care about. It's all about her and how much she has been hurt. Her kids are older now and have protective orders against her, which is her main complaint right now. She doesn't understand why they don't just deal with it, as she's so happy, when she would never do the same for them. I show empathy and am totally committed to helping her, but there's still a bit of me that can't stop getting, annoyed by her. Something just doesn't sit right with me. Assessing her for personality disorders at the moment. Maybe that will help me understand her better so I can see her side more. It's a complicated job sometimes. Sort of the reverse of this. When I was once in an inpatient facility as a teenager, the psychiatrist said, "You don't have it so bad. Some of these kids come in here and I'm like, man, I'd definitely kill myself in your position." otherwise actually not a bad doctor. He took me seriously and realized that I was just a depressed teenager and not a threat to myself or others. And I totally understand you could get burned out by dealing with seriously mentally ill children and the stuff they deal with all day, but that breach of professional decorum was absolutely stunning when I was 17. I don't think any clients are bad people, but I would say those that have certain personality disorders with no insight can cause a lot of pain to others and not ever realize or acknowledge the destruction they've caused. They also tend to live incredibly lonely, painful lives as again, they don't see their part in their problems and just feel that horrible things happen to them and place blame externally. They're also less likely to seek therapy because of this lack of awareness and are more difficult to treat. Been practicing for about 10 years now. As a previous Redditor said, we treat clients with unconditional positive regard, respect, and not judgment. If we can't do this, then it is probably not a safe space for the client. Referring on is recommended. While some clients may be challenging, our training helps us understand the underlying causes of the behavior, trauma, HX, attachment, style, personality, brain functioning, etc. So, I wouldn't consider my clients bad, but clients with limited insight or motivation is hard work. I have, however, come across very harmful parents, carers, trusted adults and or systems in my work that I consider as bad people. When working with children, one of the hardest things is working with parents who are not able or willing to be protective adults. Worse still is when systems meant to protect children, child protection and family court, end up putting them in further harm. Man, this is gonna come out weird, that's what she said. So I did 10 years in prison. For whatever reason, I seemed to attract extreme personality types. Some of my closest bros in the joint were straight up psychopaths. Let me be clear, these dudes were some of the closest friends I've had in my life. I sleep well at night knowing that A, they will never get out of prison, B, they are in level 9 prisons, Florida. Some people are just fundamentally flawed. They simply can't be rehabilitated. So do you believe that some people just truly cannot be rehabilitated, or do you think everyone can? I know what I think. I'm a therapist, and I've seen a few therapists or people in caring professions who have held their perspective about clients, and it's quite dangerous. Being non-judgmental is basically page 1 of the therapist handbook. I won't give any specific details, but I've had a client receive an offhand diagnosis from another professional which was totally inaccurate because they thought he was a bad person. It turned out, after advocating for an assessment, that the client had an intellectual disability and his processing of information and consequential thinking was impaired. I think any good therapist would never seriously believe that a client is a bad person. Not only is it a useless, irrelevant diagnosis or opinion, it's therapeutically harmful to hold them in that light, and it creates projections onto the client. Not to mention, it goes against all the good science we have on psychological development, systems theory, etc. That while there is good and bad behavior, people are not good and bad. It's far more complicated than that. I wasn't her therapist, but I know a person who has been physically, emotionally, verbally, medically forced a kid onto unnecessary medication for years, abusive, and still pretends they're the victim. I feel for her as a social worker, as she didn't have the best home life growing up, but as a person, she makes me so upset and frustrated. Her poor victims. Lack of empathy and narcissistic qualities can point you in the direction, but bad is subjective. I'd have to have a pretty solid definition of bad because it could be a lot or it could be just a handful. I've had clients I knew weren't going to progress any further, and someone who isn't going to change at all can be seen as bad. Honestly, most mental health professionals aren't going to answer questions like this. I don't believe any of my clients are bad people. The thing is, we're really only ourselves when our environment supports us, when we have what we need. Once the environment starts showing us loss, pain, and deprivation, we stop being ourselves and start being something else, an organic machine aligned to satiation and acquiring needs. Problem is, most people aren't taught by their parents how to fulfill their needs in positive ways that contribute to healthful lives. So their behavior gets determined by the easiest and most obvious paths to needs within their current environment. It's sad, but the more extreme the environment, the less themselves anyone is. This makes that need help not bad. Even the ones that refuse help do so because of lessons their environment taught them. When I was young, 3rd grade young, there was this new boy at the school. Everyone avoided him. He was an outcast to the point where if he went near the others, they would actively try to leave. But I could tell he had problems. I was always a very empathic and observant kid. I saw that he was mean, but that meanness came from a place of hurt. So when nobody else would, I approached him and became his friend, fully intent on trying to figure out what was wrong and then trying to help. He was mean to me too, even after accepting me as a friend, but I hung around him regardless, learning more about him. He had an abusive single parent, as I also did, and I had the emotional intelligence to connect the dots. He was hurt at home and was hurting those around him as a way to cope. I, unfortunately, did not have the psychology classes I have today under my belt though, and I missed a heck of a lot of major red flags. He would always tell me about the horrible things he did to animals. He thought it was funny. No matter how many times I told him not to hurt animals. I remember a cat wandered onto the school grounds and he called it over, then grabbed it and tried to break its leg. I had to shove them apart or he would have done it. He complained that it would have been really funny to watch it limp around, and that I supposedly ruined his fun. But I was his friend for a few years. I would always physically stop him from hurting anyone, animals included if I was nearby. As we hit middle school, he started getting considerably bigger than I was, and I could no longer physically stop him. But by then, I had curbed the behavior. He didn't really hurt others or animals much anymore, at least not if I was around. I still heard the stories of him doing it. He had found a new outlet when I was around. He would hurt me instead. I was also being abused at home. I was so used to it, so most of it I shrugged off, and the worst of it, I didn't have the self-confidence or self-worth to stand up for myself. I could stand up for and protect anyone else, but not myself. And I was still trying to fix him. I knew if I could just get him to be nice and stop hurting people, that he'd be okay and would make friends. And I had thought that he was only hurting people because he was hurt. So if I show him unquestioning kindness and friendship, he won't hurt as much. It had been 3 years, enough broken arms, hands, and fingers that I went from being right-handed to being ambidextrous, and I had made no progress and couldn't understand why. And then one day, end of 5th grade, I turn around and he's right behind me with a knife in his hand, holding it up as if he's about to stab me. I screamed, naturally, and he did swing it at my face, as if he was going to stab me, but stopped before it hit, then starts laughing about how it's just a joke. Teacher heard the scream, came in and saw him, and he was already in a lot of trouble for hurting other students, so he was expelled immediately. Never heard from him again. For years, I wondered what I did wrong, and then when I got to college, I took psych classes and realized that he was just a bad person, probably a sociopath. So yeah, my first patient, so to speak, at least the first person I ever tried to treat, was less of a hurt child like I thought, and more of just a bad person. Well, based on your post, you certainly did try, and you didn't get stabbed, so hopefully that person found help over time. I try not to see clients as bad people. This may sound like a gross oversimplification, but I consciously choose to believe that everyone is trying the best they can. Sure, they may have poor insight, a personality disorder, or extremely limited cognitive resources to curb their impulses, all of which can result in bad behavior. But in general, I do believe everyone is doing their best with the resources they have at their disposal. This mindset allows me to more effectively see their perspective and to work with them. And more generally, I enjoy seeing the world this way and believe it is to be true. Time for me to dust off my annual reply to these Ask Reddit threads. Therapist here. I don't share stories about my clients except in specific circumstances, e.g. we need to report an imminent suicide threat, coordinate care with a physician, etc. To me, sharing client stories to entertain strangers on the internet isn't professionally ethical. It isn't worth the risk to the client. Can you imagine if you were to see a therapist and then recognized your own story in this thread? Or someone close enough to your own story that it makes you wonder if it could be yours? How would it feel to believe that yours is the most judgeable case your therapist ever saw? And if your therapist is willing to post on Reddit about it, who else might they be telling? What if you were a person dealing with trauma who is wary of mental health professionals? Would reading this thread make you want to trust therapists more? TL, DR. I'm not going to share my clients' stories. I don't think you should either. OP. I don't expect folks who aren't in the field to be familiar with our ethics and confidentiality guidelines, but now that you do know, I think you should consider taking this thread down. If you're still considering posting client stories, please first review the APA Ethics Code if you're a psychologist, or whatever ethical guidelines are relevant to your profession. It's a little late for that. I have worked with clients whose selfish, destructive behaviors and lack of empathy, remorse, and self-reflection disturbed me. I don't see them as bad people because that's a shallow term. Everyone is a mix of good and bad, and they all had significant trauma underneath their defense mechanisms and developmental arrests. Their selfish and destructive behaviors were attempts at getting their needs met, and they did not have healthier strategies. At the same time, they're responsible for their behaviors and often are not emotionally safe to be around for other people in their life. In one-on-one therapy, it's about slowly working with the person to help them develop self-reflection, awareness, and the motivation for change. It's rewarding, even though it can be very slow. I've also worked with people like this who came to couples therapy with a partner, and then the work became about helping the partner to come out of the fog and wake up to the reality of who their partner is underneath the mask.